Picture this scene. A top-fueled dragster sits on the starting line at a national drag racing event somewhere in the late 1970s or early 1980s. The driver is strapped in, the bleach is down, the car is staged, and the tree is about to drop. But instead of the Christmas tree lighting up, law enforcement officers are walking toward the car. This actually happened, and the guy in the driver's seat was a Florida outlaw named R.L. Peyton, who had been funding his entire racing operation through stolen credit cards, stolen cars, and narcotics dealing. The story of how he got caught has become one of drag racing's most legendary tales. But here's the thing, almost none of the specific details can actually be verified, and the commonly told version of when and where it happened is factually impossible. So what really happened to R.L. Wildman Peyton, and how did a brilliant drag racer with genuine talent end up as the poster child for everything that could go wrong when crime and motorsports collide? This is that story. To understand R.L. Peyton, you have to understand South Florida in the early 1960s, because that's where this whole thing started. Before the NHRA had any real presence in the region, before there were sanctioned tracks and tech inspections and official rulebooks, the guys down in Dade County were street racing on the swampy backroads outside Miami. We're talking souped-up Studebakers going up against Mustangs in the middle of the night, with money changing hands and the local sheriff's department probably not too far behind. Randy R.L. Peyton came out of that world. He was based between Daytona Beach and Miami, depending on which location was least likely to draw heat from the local cops, as one writer put it. And from the very beginning, Peyton's entry into serious horsepower wasn't through working a day job and saving up money, or finding a wealthy sponsor, or even building cars in his garage after work. His entry point was the criminal underworld itself. His younger brother, Harrison, who everyone called Hap, wrote a book about him in 2012, and in it, he laid it out pretty plainly. In the early 1960s, there was already a full-blown drug subculture in South Florida, and the same men that dealt bales of pot and kilos of coke had access to hot Chrysler Hemis. Wildman ran with the Outlaws because he had to get a fix for his racing habit. Now, in 2025, we think of drag racing as a professional sport with corporate sponsors and TV coverage and million-dollar teams. But in the 1960s, especially down in Florida, it was still pretty much the Wild West. The line between street racers and criminals was thin, and a lot of guys crossed it. What made Peyton different was how far he was willing to go and how good he actually was at building fast cars. Photographer and journalist Jim Hill, who witnessed Peyton race in the mid-1960s and actually shot photos of him at Indianapolis and Bristol, called him a genuine Florida oddball. The Jalopy Journal, which is a respected hot rod culture publication, went even further. They called him essentially a career outlaw who donned the cloak of a drag racing virtuoso on weekends. But here's the thing about Peyton that makes him more than just another criminal who happened to race cars. The guy had real talent, serious mechanical talent. His brother's book compared him to Albert Einstein if Einstein had concentrated all of his genius on building the fastest dragster ever made and had the personality, good looks, and charisma of James Dean. Other people called him the Jimi Hendrix of drag racing, someone who broke all the barriers. One Amazon reviewer put it more carefully. If the guy could have just channeled 1/3 of his potential, he could have been a legend. So, you've got this character who's running with drug dealers and thieves, getting access to stolen Chrysler Hemis, building dragsters with borrowed and boosted parts, and then showing up at legitimate races and actually running competitive times against factory-backed teams. That's the world we're stepping into. The first time R.L. Peyton showed up at a major NHRA event was the Springnationals in Bristol, Tennessee, and the way he arrived tells you everything you need to know about how he operated. Peyton rolled into Bristol alone, driving a beat-up 1955 Ford F-100 pickup truck. Behind the truck, on a single-axle open trailer, was his top-fueled dragster. And this trailer wasn't one of those nice enclosed jobs with brakes and safety chains and proper tie-downs. This thing was tied down with ropes. Jim Hill, who was there shooting photos, described the whole setup as scruffy and mongrel-like. But the car itself, that's where things get interesting. Peyton had taken what was originally an RCS chassis, that's race car specialties, and he had absolutely savaged it. He'd hacked off tubing with a torch and then gas welded on additional wheelbase to make it longer. And when I say longer, I mean this thing was probably the longest dragster of its era. Current chassis fashion said long and flexy was fast. Peyton went one better. The engine was a 392 Chrysler Hemi, and the whole car had this cobbled-together look, like it had been built in someone's backyard with whatever parts happened to be lying around, which honestly is probably exactly what happened. Hill described it as having unwelded upright braces in places where you'd normally expect proper structural members. This was not a professional build. So, Peyton gets to Bristol, tech inspection, and immediately the NHRA officials reject his car. The reason is it doesn't have a driver's windscreen. Now, this was a safety requirement. You had to have some kind of windscreen to deflect debris and wind away from the driver's face. Peyton's car had nothing. Here's where you see the kind of guy Peyton was. He didn't argue, he didn't complain, he didn't ask for an exception. He walked back to his truck, found a pair of tin snips, walked back to the car, and clipped 2 vertical slits into the cowl. Then he bent the metal forward and said, "Okay, I got a windscreen now." The tech inspectors held a hasty conference. They looked at the rule book and couldn't find anything that said the windscreen had to be of plexiglass or that it had to be a certain size or shape. It just said you needed a windscreen. One tech inspector reportedly muttered, "It's his butt strapped in that piece of shit. If he wants to risk it running it, okay by us." So they let him run.
And then Peyton went out in the first round and beat Tom Hoover's factory-backed SOHC Ford. Just absolutely beat it. The car lost both front tires at the finish line from the force, but Peyton won the round. His immediate move after winning tell you everything about his financial situation. He ran over to Tom Hoover, the guy he had just beaten, and asked to borrow front tires. Then he asked if he could bum enough nitromethane to make the next round. Think about that for a second. This guy just showed up with a rope-tied dragster, made a windscreen out of tin snips, beat a factory Ford, and then had to beg for tires and fuel to continue racing. And Hoover apparently gave it to him, because that's the kind of community drag racing had back then, even if you were racing against each other. Peyton lost in the next round, but he posted either the second or third lowest elapsed time of the entire meet. Jim Hill, who was shooting photos that weekend, said the car was crude, but Peyton absolutely knew what it took to go fast. At Indianapolis that same year, Peyton's cobbled-together dragster ran middle 7-second passes at over 215 miles per hour. To put that in context, that was legitimate top fuel performance for 1966. This wasn't some joke car. This was actually fast. One of the stories that came out of Peyton's Miami racing is that he'd run at Miami Hollywood Speedway at night, and after every pass, sparks would fly from under the car past the finish line. What was happening is the car was so long and so flexible that when Peyton let off the throttle, the chassis would flex and the oil pan would scrape the ground. This was grinding down the bottom of the oil pan every single pass. Peyton's solution? He just stuck another oil pan on it. He started carrying multiple oil pans to swap out at each event. That's not engineering. That's just making do with what you've got and accepting that your car is going to scrape itself to death every time you race it. The race records show Peyton competing in AA fuel dragster class through at least early 1967. At Dragway 42 in August 1966, he started 13th and finished 5th, losing in the quarterfinals to Chris the Greek Karamessinis, who was one of the legends of the era. At Palm Beach International Raceway in February 1967, Peyton started 3rd and finished 2nd, again losing to Karamessinis in the semifinals. These are documented race results. You can look them up. This wasn't just some guy showing up and making noise. Peyton was actually competitive at national events against some of the best fuel racers in the country. His brother, Hap, who was his crew chief starting at age 16, said they shared every car they built together, every race, every wreck, every cheap motel, and every set of beautiful twins they met. That's a quote from Hap's book. The two of them were apparently inseparable during this period, running from race to race with no money, no backup, and just this crazy ultra-long dragster that kept grinding its oil pan into the asphalt. Now, the book claims that Peyton was one of the first men to officially break 200 miles per hour in a dragster. That claim needs to be taken with some skepticism because Don Garlits is widely credited with breaking 200 in 1964, which would have been before Peyton was running documented national events. But it's possible Peyton broke 200 at some independent event or match race that wasn't officially recorded. We just don't know. What we do know is that Peyton's documented racing activity becomes pretty scarce after the late 1960s. There are forum posts from people who remember him showing up at independent fuel meets into the 1970s, but he's not appearing in the national event results anymore. Race promoter Jack Redd recalled that Peyton once broke down coming to one of his fuel meets and hitchhiked to the event anyway. As Redd remembered it, Peyton told him, "Jack, I promise I would be here, so I am here." That gives you the sense of the kind of commitment Peyton had to racing. But here's the thing about that commitment. Racing top fuel in the 1970s and early 1980s cost an absolutely insane amount of money, and there was almost no way to make that money back through prize purses alone. Let me walk you through the math because this is important to understanding why Peyton turned to crime in the first place. Running a top fuel dragster in the late 1970s and early 1980s cost somewhere between $75,000 and $150,000 per season. In 2025 dollars, that's about $275,000 to $550,000, and that's if nothing went seriously wrong. Prize money at even the biggest national events might return 10 to 20% of your operating costs if you won. Even if you won every single national event in a season, you might net $20,000 to $40,000 in purse money total. The math has never made sense. It still doesn't make sense today, but it was even worse back then. Here's why it cost so much. A top fuel engine required complete disassembly and inspection every single run. Not every race day, every single run. That means you're taking the engine apart, inspecting every component, and replacing a bunch of parts after each 4-second pass down the track. Pistons needed replacement every 1 to 2 runs. Connecting rods lasted 2 to 3 runs if you were lucky. The Goodyear slickers wore out after 4 to 6 runs. Then there's nitromethane. In 1980, nitromethane cost about $10 to $20 per gallon, and each run consumed 8 to 12 gallons. So every time you staged the car, you were burning $80 to $240 worth of fuel in about 4 seconds just on fuel alone. Add in travel costs to get across the country, hotel rooms for your crew, entry fees, and the inevitable catastrophic engine failures where you're replacing the entire engine block because something let go at 8,000 RPM and turned your Hemi into a grenade. The only people who could afford to run top fuel legitimately were people with serious sponsorship, or people who had independent wealth, or people who had really good day jobs and were willing to lose money on racing as a hobby. R.L. Peyton had none of those things. What Peyton had was access to the criminal underworld in South Florida in the 1960s and 1970s, and that underworld had 3 things he needed: stolen credit cards, stolen cars he could part out or sell, and narcotics he could move for cash. The Jalopy Journal laid it out pretty directly. What set R.L. Peyton apart was that he bankrolled his drag racing empire with stolen credit cards, boosted cars, and a side hustle in narcotics, a triple threat of crime, velocity, and audacity.
Now, here's where we run into a problem with the historical record, because the specific mechanics of Peyton's criminal operation are not publicly documented anywhere that I could find. How did he get the stolen credit card numbers? How did he use them to purchase nitromethane and parts and travel without getting caught immediately? How long did this operation last? Who else was involved? None of that is available in any source I could access online. What we do know is that it happened. Multiple independent sources confirm that Peyton was funding his racing through crime. His brother's book acknowledges it. Jim Hill's first-hand account from 2002 mentions it. The Jalopy Journal article about outlaw hot rodders confirms it. This wasn't rumor or speculation. This was how Peyton operated. And here's the thing that makes it even more brazen. Peyton wasn't just using stolen credit cards to buy parts for street cars or to fund a hobby in his garage. He was showing up at NHRA national events, at legitimate sanctioned races, with a car that was at least partially funded through criminal activity. He was staging against factory teams and legitimate privateers and running competitive times, and nobody knew. Or at least nobody could prove where the money was coming from. Think about what that means. To run a fuel car, you need a steady supply of nitromethane, which in the 1960s and 70s, you couldn't just buy at the local gas station. You need racing fuel, you need racing oil, you need specific parts from specialty manufacturers, you need tires from Goodyear, you need entry fees paid to the NHRA. All of this creates a paper trail, and somehow Peyton was managing to fund all of this through stolen credit cards and not get caught. Now, in the 2020s, that doesn't seem like it would work for very long, because we have computerized credit card tracking and instant fraud detection and all of that. But in 1968, or 1972, or even 1978, there was not a computerized tracking system for credit cards. If you played your cards right, literally, these things could be a source of what seemed like free income for a pretty long time. The other thing Peyton had going for him was that he was constantly moving. Miami to Daytona to Bristol to Indianapolis to wherever the next race was. He wasn't staying in one place long enough for local law enforcement to build a case. And the various police departments across the country weren't communicating with each other the way they do now. If you bought parts in Florida with a stolen card and then raced in Tennessee and then moved on to Indiana, you could stay ahead of the investigation for a while. But only for a while.
Here's what we know for certain. At some point in the late 1970s or early 1980s, law enforcement caught up with R.L. Peyton. He was arrested. His racing career ended. He went to prison, and the story of his arrest became one of the most legendary tales in drag racing history. The commonly told version of the story goes like this. Peyton was at the 1980 NHRA Southern Nationals in Atlanta. He staged his car for a run, and just as the tree was about to drop, law enforcement officers walked up and arrested him right there at the starting line, in front of the entire crowd. Now that is an incredible image, and the story has been repeated so many times that it's become part of drag racing folklore. There's a forum thread from 2024 titled "Arrested at the Starting Line, R.L. Peyton's Story." The Jalopy Journal confirmed that Peyton lost not only his race car, but also his freedom, snared by the consequences of his high-octane existence. But here's the problem. The specific details of that story cannot be verified from any publicly available source, and more importantly, the commonly cited date and location are factually impossible. The 1980 NHRA Southern Nationals in Atlanta did not exist. That event never happened. Let me walk you through why. Atlanta Dragway is in Commerce, Georgia, about 68 miles from downtown Atlanta. From 1976 through 1979, the track hosted IHRA events, including the IHRA Dixie Nationals. The last IHRA event at Atlanta was in 1979. In July 1980, Norman Moose Para purchased the facility and switched the sanctioning from IHRA to NHRA, but no national event was held at the track in 1980. It was a gap year during the ownership transition. The inaugural NHRA Southern Nationals took place on April 26, 1981. It was won by Shirley Muldowney in Top Fuel. That was the first time the NHRA Southern Nationals existed. So if Peyton was arrested at Atlanta Dragway, it was either at one of the IHRA Dixie Nationals between 1976 and 1979, or at the first NHRA Southern Nationals in April 1981, or possibly at some non-sanctioned match race or independent event during the gap year. The year 1980 appears to be incorrect based on all available evidence about the track's event history. It's also possible, and honestly this seems likely, that the arrest occurred at an entirely different venue or event, and the Atlanta Association developed through decades of people retelling the story. That's how oral history works. Details shift, locations change, specific dates get fuzzy, but the core narrative remains.
So what can we actually verify about the arrest? Not much. No court records for R.L. Peyton are publicly accessible online. No newspaper articles from any publication have been located through searches. No law enforcement reports are available. We don't know if the charges were federal, which they could have been, since credit card fraud across state lines can invoke federal jurisdiction, or if they were state charges. We don't know if Peyton went to trial or took a plea deal. We don't know how long he was incarcerated. We don't know if they were co-conspirators or if he was arrested alone. What we do know is that multiple independent sources who have no reason to make this up all confirm that Peyton was arrested, that it ended his racing career, and that the circumstances became legendary in the drag racing community. Jim Hill, who witnessed Peyton race in the 1960s, said he knew enough bizarre R.L. Peyton tales to literally fill a book, including legal as well as pseudo-legal activities that would curl your hair. Hill clearly knew more than he published, but he was writing in 2002, and whatever he knew, he chose to describe carefully. The most detailed account almost certainly exists in Hap Peyton's 2012 book, Wildman, The Fast and Funny Times of Wildman R.L. Peyton. The book is 236 pages and was written by Peyton's younger brother and crew chief, who was there for the whole thing. But that book is not available online in full text form, and I wasn't able to access it for this research. The book apparently covers the arrest and its aftermath, but without reading it, we don't know what level of detail Hap provides or what sources he's drawing on. What we can piece together from the available sources is this. Peyton's criminal activity eventually drew the attention of law enforcement, whether it was the FBI or the Secret Service, which handles credit card fraud, or local police, or some combination, we don't know. At some point, they built a case, and at some point, they decided to make the arrest at a racetrack. Why would they do that? Well, if you're law enforcement and you know this guy is going to be at a specific location on a specific date and he's going to be strapped into a race car, that's not a bad time to grab him. He can't run, he's in public, there are witnesses, and frankly, there's probably a bit of theater to it. You make an example. You show the racing community that this kind of thing has consequences.
The Jalopy Journal article suggested exactly that. They wrote that Peyton's arrest and imprisonment became the perfect ammunition for politicians and newspapers alike, crafting narratives of caution and fear to sway the masses. R.L. Peyton became the poster child for the dire consequences awaiting those who veer off the societal highway, choosing instead the twisted byways of hot-rodding rebellion. That language suggests there was media coverage at the time. It suggests that Peyton's arrest was used as a cautionary tale, but I could not find a single newspaper article from any publication about it, which is strange because you'd think a drag racer getting arrested at a national event would have made at least the local papers, if not the racing publications. It's possible the coverage existed and has just never been digitized. It's possible it was covered in local Georgia or Florida papers that aren't searchable online. It's also possible the media coverage was less extensive than the Jalopy Journal article suggests, and the cautionary tale developed more through word of mouth in the racing community. What happened to Peyton after the arrest is similarly unclear. We know he went to prison, we know his racing career ended, we know he was not present at major NHRA events after the late 1970s or early 1980s. Whether the NHRA formally banned him or whether he was simply unable to race due to incarceration, we don't know. One thing that stands out is how little documentation exists about any of this. In the modern era, if a professional racer got arrested at a track, it would be all over the internet within hours. There'd be court records and police reports and newspaper articles and forum discussions. But Peyton's arrest happened in an era before the internet, before digital record keeping, before everything was searchable and archived online. What we're left with is oral history, stories told by people who were there or who knew people who were there, the legend of the outlaw racer who got handcuffed at the starting line, and the frustrating reality that the specific details, the date, the location, the charges, the agencies involved, the trial, the sentence, all of that exists somewhere, if it exists at all, in places that aren't accessible through online research. This is one of those moments where you hit the limits of what you can verify from publicly available sources. I can tell you with confidence that R.L. Peyton was a real top-fuel drag racer. I can tell you he funded his racing through crime. I can tell you he was arrested and that his arrest ended his career. But the play-by-play of how it happened, the mechanics of the sting operation, the specific moment when the handcuffs went on, that level of detail is not available. If you wanted to tell that story with journalistic accuracy, you'd need to do three things. First, you'd need to read Hap Peyton's book cover to cover. Second, you'd need to interview Hap directly. He was apparently willing to talk about his brother's story since he wrote a book and did radio interviews about it. Third, you'd need to try to find court records, which would require knowing what jurisdiction the case was tried in and possibly filing Freedom of Information requests. But here's what I can tell you. The absence of verifiable details doesn't make the story less real. It just makes it harder to tell with the kind of specificity that we expect from historical narratives in 2025. Sometimes the legend is all that survives, and you have to be honest about that.
R.L. Wildman Peyton died in Florida in November 2011. The announcement came through a post on the draglist.com forum from race promoter Jack Red, who had been informed by Hap Peyton. The forum tributes reflected genuine affection from people who remembered him. Rest in peace, R.L. You were more than just a racer. The sport needs more men like you now. That last line is interesting, right? The sport needs more men like you now. What does that mean? Does the sport need more outlaws, more criminals, more people funding their racing through stolen credit cards? Obviously not. But I think what that forum poster was getting at is that the sport needs more characters, more people who are willing to show up with a rope-tied dragster and make a windscreen out of tin snips and race against factory teams with nothing but talent and audacity. Peyton's brother, Hap, continued working on a planned movie adaptation of the Wildman story. He maintained a website at wildmanthemovie.com and did interviews, including one on Racers Reunion Radio around 2013, where RL was described as colorful both on and off the track and regarded as one of the sport's most interesting characters. One of the Amazon reviews of Hap's book probably put it best. The reviewer wrote, "If the guy could have just channeled 1/3 of his potential, he could have been a legend." And that's the tragedy of R.L. Wildman Peyton. In a nutshell, the talent was there, the mechanical genius was there, the commitment to going fast was absolutely there. But instead of finding legitimate sponsors, or working a day job, or building a sustainable racing program, Peyton chose the outlaw path. He chose crime, and that choice eventually destroyed everything. So what do we make of R.L. Wildman Peyton? Because this is a complicated story about a complicated guy. On one hand, Peyton was a grifter.
He was a thief. He dealt drugs. He used stolen credit cards. He associated with dangerous people. He built his entire racing operation on criminal activity. And when you do that, when you make those choices, there are consequences. The law catches up with you eventually. Your career ends. Your freedom ends. And you become a cautionary tale. On the other hand, Peyton had legitimate talent. Jim Hill, who photographed some of the greatest drag racers of the 1960s, said Peyton absolutely knew what it took to go fast. The guy showed up at Bristol in 1966 with a rope-tied dragster and beat Tom Hoover's factory Ford. He ran middle sevens at Indianapolis. He was competitive at national events against Chris the Greek Katamisinas. That's not luck, that's skill. The question that hangs over the whole story is what could Peyton have accomplished if he'd found a legitimate way to fund his racing? What if he'd gotten a sponsor? What if he'd worked a good day job and saved up money? What if he'd partnered with someone who had resources? Could he have become a national champion? Could he have been in the history books alongside Garlitz and Katamisinas and the other legends of that era? We'll never know, because Peyton made different choices. He chose the outlaw path, and that path led exactly where you'd expect it to lead, to an arrest, to prison, to the end of his racing career. But here's the thing about drag racing in the 1960s and 70s. The line between legitimate racers and outlaws was thinner than we might like to admit. A lot of guys were running questionable operations. A lot of guys were stretching the rules or cutting corners or finding creative ways to fund their racing. Peyton just took it further than most and paid the price for it. The story of his arrest at the starting line, whether it happened exactly the way it's been told or whether the details have shifted over decades of retelling, has become part of drag racing folklore. It's the story of what happens when talent and crime collide. It's the story of an underdog racer who could beat factory teams but couldn't escape his own choices. It's the story of a genuine Florida oddball who had the skills to be a legend but became a cautionary tale instead. And maybe that's the real legacy of R.L. Wildman Peyton. Not as a hero, not as someone to emulate, but as a reminder that talent alone isn't enough. That how you fund your dreams matters just as much as what you do with them. That there are no shortcuts that don't come with consequences. Peyton showed up at Bristol in 1966 with nothing but a rope-tied dragster and beat a factory Ford. That part is documented. That part is real. And for one weekend in Tennessee, R.L. Wildman Peyton proved he belonged on that starting line with the best fuel racers in the country. But somewhere down the road, whether it was 1977 or 1979 or 1981, whether it was at Atlanta Dragway or somewhere else entirely, the law caught up with him. And the man who had once staged against legends was handcuffed and led away. The dragster that had run middle sevens at Indianapolis was impounded, and the outlaw racing career of R.L. Wildman Peyton came to an end. That's the story as best as it can be told from the available sources. A brilliant mechanic and a gutsy racer who funded his dreams through crime and paid the price for it. A guy who could make a windscreen out of tin snips and beat factory teams, but couldn't outrun the consequences of his choices. A legend and a cautionary tale wrapped into one. Wherever R.L. Wildman Peyton is now, he's probably still arguing with tech inspectors and bumming nitromethane and trying to figure out how to make his dragster just a little bit longer and a little bit faster. And maybe somewhere in there, he's thinking about the choices he made and the career that could have been.